Let them praises give Jehovah. They were made at his command. Them forever he established. His decree shall ever stand. From the earth, oh, praise Jehovah. All ye floods, ye dragons all. Fire and hail and snow and vapor, stormy winds that hear him call. Let them praises give Jehovah, for his name alone is high. And his glory is exalted. And his glory is exalted. And his glory is exalted, far above the earth and sky.
I think this is the last consecutive week that I'll be here. That I think I'm teaching one more time in December, and I'll teach on probably a subject unrelated to what we've been talking about. So this will be our last class that we'll have on this topic of ethics, part of this series. Also, if anyone needs a handout, I left most of them on that back table. Grab those for you if you need them. But before we get into our discussion for today, let's see if we can, let's just review what we have been talking about. So, the first 3 weeks, we talked about three sort of bird's eye view ways of thinking about ethics. First one was the idea that the ends justifies the means. It's all about the results that you achieve with your actions, and that's what really matters in terms of something's right or wrong. Does anyone remember the name of that way of thinking? I think it's on the tip of your tongue. What was it? Consequentialism? Okay, I could tell it was right there. All right. Then the next week we talked about the idea of sort of the opposite, which is that what matters is the act itself, that acts in and of themselves are right and wrong, and you have a duty to do the right action. So it doesn't matter what the results are, but there are particular kinds of deeds that deed is always good or that deed is always bad. Does anyone remember our word for that?
Deontology.
Deontology. Okay. And then the third one, does anyone just remember the third one? The term is a lot more common. Virtue. So virtue ethics was our third way of thinking about things. And virtue ethics is less about the results. It's not about the action itself, though sometimes that's important. But it's more about the person, that you as a person have to develop virtues within yourself. And when you develop virtues like the virtue of courage, like the virtue of patience, like the virtue of charity, of love, then you become the sort of person who will make the right choices. And sometimes that'll line up with how a deontologist might think about it. Sometimes that'll line up with how a consequentialist might think about it. But you're not really concerned with the action itself or the results, but you're concerned with making sure that you have become a virtuous person. And as Christians, we might define that as making sure that you become more like Christ. Okay. And then this week and last week, we're looking at particular topics within ethics. So those were sort of bird's eye view. Here's how people think about ethics in general. Here's how we know what's right and wrong. And then we looked at particular subjects. So last week, we looked at political theology or political ethics. And I try to make it clear that it's less about partisan politics, Republican versus Democrat or something like that. Who should you vote for? And it's more about how do Christians view their relationship to the powers around them. So that should certainly evoke Paul in the book of Ephesians and several other writings of Paul. But how Christians think about, okay, there are these powers around me. For him, he was certainly not a part of. He was a Roman citizen, but he's not a Roman authority by any means. for us, we have more potential to be a part of the powers around us. We can hold office in America. But there's still this, we'll say, this interesting relationship between how, as a Christian, do you think about the government, the state? Is that something that we should participate in? And a big part of that discussion that we hinted at, but we couldn't spend a whole lot of time talking about, was the idea of military service. So a lot for how Christians have thought about their relationship with the state, with the powers, with the government throughout the history of Christianity for the last 2,000 years. A big part of that discussion is, can I participate in the military? Can I engage in war on behalf of my country? And Christians have had different thoughts about that. And I said when we talked about political theology that this has been sort of the dominant topic throughout the history of Christianity. All of these big events in Christian history have revolved around this question. How do Christians relate to the state? We've looked at Constantine, we looked at how this is a big thing for the Reformation with Luther and Calvin, is this relationship between them and Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, and continue to be a big deal. Today, for our second topic, it's very related. In fact, like I said, we hinted at that. We are talking about violence, and we're going to specifically talk about war and peace. And while political theology is maybe the dominant topic, the way that Christians have, or one of these big subjects that has shaped Christian history, violence and Christians' response to violence and their relationship with peace and war, I would say, is maybe the most important lens for how Christians have thought about everything else that's a part of the Christian life. So while it's maybe usually in terms of politics and political theology, that this subject has influenced how Christians have viewed their place in the world more than anything else. But again, it's very related to what we talked about last week. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap. Hopefully y'all can deal with that. It's not really up to you. You have to deal with it. Okay. So, peaceableness and violence, I take as these archetypal, or peacefulness at least, as an archetypal virtue for Christians. That this is shaping how Christians view their relationship with the world. When we're talking about war and peace specifically, so that's war is sort of violence at a macro scale. There's individual violence that Christians might participate in. Clearly, bad violence would be to murder someone. We all think that's wrong. But there's also something that's not, we might not all say is bad, like your family is being attacked, and you want to defend your family, and you have to act violently in that way. And some of us might say, yeah, that's an acceptable form of violence. And that's all on an individual scale. But if you take it to sort of a broader scale where it's applying to a lot of people, to a whole country perhaps, then we're talking about war. So it's this big version of violence. And Christians have thought about war in a few different ways. The first way that we're going to talk about, that's on your handout, is what's called the just war theory. And this really gets going around the time of Augustine. Y'all didn't ask for a timeline, but I'll give you a timeline. So we'll say Jesus and Pentecost. So this is the 1st century. And then go to time, we're in the 21st century now. Augustine is going to be right around here. So excuse my handwriting. He's in like the 4th century, I think. We'll come to Aquinas in a little bit. And he's in the 12th. And then we'll come back to all this, I promise. And that's the 16th, I think that's right. Okay. So Augustine is the last of the early church fathers. So the time of the patristics, which is our fancy word for time of the church fathers, it's really this first 400 years of Christian history. As different Christian thinkers are helping us think about, they finally get the New Testament, because as y'all know, the apostles, the first century church didn't have a New Testament. They didn't have the Bible. But as we're collecting the Bible, we have a lot of these Christians thinking about the church and Christianity. And Augustine's basically our last guide along that train. And he lives around the same time as Constantine. We talked about this last week. Can anyone remind us what's significant about Emperor Constantine of Rome?
He formalized religion.
Okay, so, and specifically the Christian religion, that Christianity was outlawed before Constantine. There was these different ways of persecution that happened. While Constantine doesn't make Christianity a state religion, he is the first emperor to allow Christianity. And Augustine's around this time. And Augustine writes some thoughts for how we should think about war. And he says, as Christians, war is only acceptable given three criteria. And I have these on your handout. First criteria is that it needs to be declared by a legitimate authority. So he's basically saying you can't have a mob. Just a group of people say, hey, we want to go declare war on this group. He might, maybe a closer or slightly more modern example, this is me just guessing, he would say the Confederate States can't declare we're going to go to war against the North because they're not a legitimate authority. They're seceding from a legitimate authority. The second criteria is that you have to have a just cause. You can't go to war with someone just because you want their land. You can't say, I want your property, so I'm going to take it. That's not a just
Russia
cause.
and Ukraine.
Russia and Ukraine. That'd be a very good current example. Is this land used to belong to us? We're going to take it back now, and it hasn't belonged to you in a long time. And then our third one is that you have to have a good intention with going to war. So maybe controversially, some people at least might say this is what's at stake here with the war in Iraq after, I don't know when we did that. 2003, 2004, when did we? Whatever. The idea being, okay, maybe there's a just cause here that this country has these weapons of mass destruction. But someone might secretly like that, but that's not really the intention. The intention is for oil or whatever sort of cynical reason you might read into it. And so you say the cause might be good, but really your intentions here are not good. And we can disagree about what's actually going on there, but that's how some people might have interpreted that. So these three criteria: that it has to be declared by a legitimate authority, it has to have a just cause, and you have to have good intention. I'll stop here for a second. What do y'all think about that? Do those criteria, do you say, yeah, that's the criteria that I as a Christian can get behind. Those are the criteria for declaring a war and it being acceptable.
I like the criteria, but it's very subjective.
Sure, yeah. Could you see people disagreeing Okay, every time. Probably with my example with the Iraq War. There's some people say, oh, no, there were good intentions there. And there are other people who say, no, there were bad intentions there. Do y'all agree with that? Do y'all think that this criteria is too subjective?
Yeah.
What other criteria, is there any criteria you'd want to see on this list?
So you always would like there to be an end point. Okay, we're going to go into this until we accomplish what?
Okay.
So that it's not just this, forever and ever and ever kind of thing.
Yeah, that would seem to You might relate that to like the just cause, perhaps. Like, okay, what's our reason for going in here? And you could add that it needs to be measurable. There needs to be some sort of standard here. So then that might be people's problem with something like Vietnam. Maybe there was a just cause, but there's no goal here. Where what are we achieving here, and when can we say it's time to get out? Vietnam may not have been the best example, but y'all. Okay.
Like the war for independence.
Yeah.
So are you suggesting that should be another criteria, is that some people should be able to fight for their independence? Yeah. So again, I think this would fall under cause, but it's a different way of thinking about it. Because for me, when I see just cause, my mind goes to like World War II, and I start thinking, okay, there's an oppressive power that's spreading. They're murdering people systematically. That's as just a cause as you could imagine. So we need to go stop the Axis powers, right? But that's not. We can't be limited by that, because there are these other just causes, like my own people are currently being oppressed, and so we want to throw off our oppressors. But then we get into it becomes a little bit tricky with the legitimate authority then, right? Because the colonists aren't the people in power. And in fact, that would seem to be like they're an illegitimate authority to declare war. And yet, I think all of us in here are glad that they did so. So that's a good sort of getting at some of the complexities.
Two sides to every story. It's
Yeah.
a war, so.
Go ahead.
There should be a good chance of winning.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
Would you be interested?
And as soon as you said that, that made me feel like I'm missing something. Because maybe it's Aquinas. One of them talks about that exact thing. So you're in good company with some theological giants, Bob.
And there needs to be a definition of what winning is.
Yes, and that goes back to your original point, is we have to have some sort of goal here, standard here. But yeah, this is a big thing for other Christian thinkers, is there has to be some sort of goal or a possibility of arriving at that goal. But were you going to add something else to it? Okay.
Maybe. I agree. Because I think about David and Goliath. There was no reasonable expectation for David to think other than he had faith in God. And so sometimes it goes beyond, we've got better numbers, better weapons, better whatever. World War II, possibly an example of that, if in fact God was intervening and helping, because it doesn't matter if you got the majority or not. If you're on God's side, you got to win.
Yeah.
Hence Revelation coming up.
Before we go back, it's worth pointing out that I think for a lot of us, maybe pushback then would be, if using World War II as this sort of clear example of like, we can all agree this was a just cause. But hypothetically, what if we said there is no chance of winning? Germany's too powerful. In that case, do we let them sweep across Europe and the world? Do we let them continue to commit genocide? Or do you say, even though we're going to lose, we still ought to fight back? This is a big question for like resistance fighters. Again, using World War II as an example, French resistance fighters might be a good example. It's been very good here.
All right, I want to go back to this thing of a goal that you can achieve,
Okay.
and use
Bobby had a
Iraq
controversial comment.
as an example. When the first time, the goal was to get Saddam Hussein in Iraq out of Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
And that as soon as they had beat him back to Iran and had him out of Kuwait, they ended the war.
Mm-hmm.
The second time we went in, Saddam's such a bad guy, we've got to get rid of him.
Yeah.
So the goal was regime change, but nobody looked to see what would happen when you achieved the goal.
Yes. So they had the
So
goal.
I want to kind of tack that on there.
Yeah.
You not only need to have a just goal you're going to reach that's a good goal, but it has to be a goal that's actually going to make things better.
Yeah.
Because when you look and there is nobody else to take over,
Yeah.
maybe you better leave the devil you've got in place.
Yeah. I'm going to make a comment on that, but first, you have something to add.
Yeah, I'm wondering, we can see with the attack on Pearl Harbor, a just cause in response to that and entering into World War II. In the aftermath of World War II, with the Truman Doctrine that gets us into Korea, Vietnam, to stop the spread of communism, not because we've been attacked, but to prevent communism from spreading, which communists, Stalin was an ally during World War II. So, would the Truman Doctrine be considered a just cause in the same way as being bombed, being attacked? So it seems like it gets into subjective decisions for that.
So yeah, two great things that are worth pointing. One is it needs to be pointed out that what's going on here, or what Augustine is trying to help us with, is to think about when is it okay to go to war? Because as Christians, we shouldn't want to go to war. We should not be warmongers. And so we need to have criteria for when we think it's okay to go to war. Now, what Augustine is not helping us with is how to efficiently or in a Christian way engage in war. And so there are a lot of these other questions that still remain that Augustine is not helping us with. And sort of thinking through what are the results of this. Even if we have a just cause, what's going to happen afterward? That's a big question. And then I think we're right to bring out the subjective nature of these. And I don't think Augustine would deny that. He would say, yes, this is incredibly subjective, or at least maybe a better way of saying it is it's very interpretive. That as Christians, we still have to argue about what qualifies as a just cause. But he's just trying to lay out, these are the things that we should be arguing about. If we can't even pretend that there is a just cause that's going on here, if the only reason that's given by the king, for the emperor for him, is, I want that land, then this isn't even on the table. What are we talking about? This is not even remotely close to being a just war. But if we can maybe start to get at a discussion, well, is responding to a bombing versus sort of these doctrines about, state policy about the spread of communism. Maybe this is just, that's not just, but there's a discussion to be had there. All right, last comment on this, and then we'll move on.
I can say that World War I was an example of just a quagmire of pointless, needless, death and fighting and all that. It all started because of Ferdinand being assassinated, and then that spiraling out of control, and you got all the monarchies and oligarchs and all that. And it's just talk about no just cause.
Yeah.
For all those millions of people.
And then it makes it hard for the people who have to live after that, recognize this is what my friends died for, this is what my children died for nothing. Few comments before we move on to the next point. So Augustine gives us those criteria. Aquinas, the great systematizer of Christian thought, he takes that and formalizes it a little bit more. But a name that I mentioned the first week class, I think I mentioned it briefly last week, and then we'll come up again this week, is Reinhold Niebuhr. A name that might sound familiar to you. He's on the cover of Time magazine long ago. He is a Christian theologian who would represent this way of thinking, just war thinking, that there are certain instances where we have to participate, and we don't like violence. Violence isn't good, it's not fun, but sometimes we have to engage in it because we have just cause because there's some sort of good intention behind it, and so sometimes war is just something that you have to do. This becomes the dominant position, how Christians think about war after Constantine. So around the time of Augustine, and then for the next, I can't do math, 1700 years. That this is how Christians are thinking about war and violence is. We don't like it, but sometimes we got to do it. And so we have to be able, and this becomes for a long time, whenever you go to war, these Christian nations in Europe have to say, okay, here's our just cause, here's our intentions behind this. They have to sort of defend their choice to go to war. But before Augustine, this is not the dominant way of thinking about violence or about war. Christians are, by and large, for the first few hundred years of Christianity, pacifists. And this dominates Christian thinking for a few hundred years. And then it is the minority, if anyone thinks that, for a long time, for 1,000-ish years. And then during the Reformation, you get Luther, you get Calvin, you get Zwingli, he's doing his own thing. And you get the Anabaptist movement, and we talked about that last week. And they have some radical thoughts about how Christians ought to engage in government, but they also, probably their most distinctive belief, is that they are pacifists. They endure a lot of suffering and persecution for this belief among many, and they can't fight back during this. And so a lot of Anabaptists die in the beginning of the Reformation, the Anabaptist movement. And this has been sort of a minority stream throughout for the last few hundred years of Christian history since the Anabaptists arose. Okay. A few reasons why Christians might think that this is the better way to think about violence and about war, in contrast with just war theory, that we should be nonviolent. The first is simply, and we're going to come back to this, simply because it produces a distinctive form of Christian living. This shows that we are different from the world, as Paul, to use Paul's language. That we don't live by the same criteria as the world. It makes sense in worldly terms to come up with reasons for going to war, but that's not how Christians ought to think. This is a big deal for Mennonites, which are probably the biggest subgroup of Anabaptists that you've heard of. Amish would probably be the most famous group of Anabaptists you've heard of. This is how Stanley Hauerwas thinks about it. He's a living theologian. We're going to talk more about him in a minute, but I want you to be thinking about, I might be spelling this wrong. These two guys represent two different ways of thinking. You might think of. We'll come back to that. So, distinctiveness. That's our first reason why Christians might think that they ought to be nonviolent. Our second reason I'll throw out there for you is there seems to be a major part of Christian teaching. One of Christ's most famous, at least, and maybe one of his more central teachings, is to love your enemy. And it's not turn the other cheek. It's not really clear how you could love your enemy while you are also attacking them or killing them. I've heard people give explanations for that. I'm sure y'all could give an explanation for how you could love your enemy as you are killing them. But to me, you're jumping through hoops at that point if you're trying to bring those two things together and say that you were loving your enemy while you were simultaneously killing them. And then the third reason is to say that this vision of Christian living, a nonviolent vision for Christian living, is what we see in the cross. That this is the ultimate example of nonviolent living, is the willingness for other people to commit evil against you and to not push back against it. And to let that violence occur to you without inflicting violence upon your oppressors. Now, there are a lot of reasons, and let's take a few minutes. I want to hear from you. I'm sure you got some. What are some arguments you would give against this way of thinking? So, nonviolence, because it's a distinctive Christian form of living. It goes with Christ's teachings, love your enemy. It's what we see displayed on the cross. But I'm confident there's probably at least a few people in this room who think, well, there's other parts of the Bible that might push against this. So what are some arguments you would give against this sort of nonviolent vision?
Well, I think it would be something that you would start out with, something that would be, that's my motto, I guess, so to speak, but it all depends on what you're faced with and the circumstances.
Yeah.
And
so I think this is, to my mind, but I do want to hear other things, this is the biggest argument, which is, yes, that is the ideal. That is what we want. But when we live in the real world with practical questions, it's a lesser of two evils. So it's acknowledging violence is evil, but sometimes it's the lesser of two evils. Okay. Other thoughts?
Heard someone explain it about a Christian killing his enemy, saying, well, I love my enemy, but I love my family more.
Okay.
I love my country more.
Yeah. So again, it's kind of that lesser of two evils. This is not great. I'm not displaying my love in the best way, but I am displaying my love for these other people. Other thoughts?
When you call it, back to Augustine talking about a just war,
Yeah.
it's just, it's good.
Okay.
So it's better than not doing it.
Yeah.
Because it's a good thing.
Yeah,
Whatever that.
we don't have a whole lot of time to dissect this because there's other stuff I want to talk about, but this is huge. There's one way of thinking about this is the lesser of two evils, that violence is bad and we shouldn't want to do it, but sometimes it would be worse to not do it. And that's a pretty common way of thinking about it. But another way of thinking about this is to say that, no, violence is not inherently bad. It can be bad. Murder is bad. Unjust violence is bad. But when violence is done justly, in the case of, again, we can all get behind defeating the Nazis, that is just violence, then it's no longer evil. It's just another action. Violence is only evil in certain contexts. So this, I just want to point out, this is a different way of thinking about it than the previous two comments. Other thoughts?
Who's going to decide whether it's just or not?
Well, the simplest answer to that is you do. You have to decide, am I going to do this because do I think this is just or do I think it's unjust? And so hopefully you never participate in violence that you think is unjust. If you are participating in violence that you do think is unjust, then you've clearly violated your conscience and something bad is going on there.
The Crusades were religious wars to fight the Muslims who had taken over the Middle East.
Yeah.
When our forces on D-Day started out, Dwight Eisenhower gave a statement to all of those guys that this is a just crusade. And a lot of those guys had no idea of the depravity of the Nazis. And they didn't really realize that until they got into these death camps.
Yeah, it's not until afterward they know that the Holocaust is happening.
And so it was a real eye-opener of the horrendous things that the Nazis were doing.
Yeah. Which is interesting, one, because the people who participated in World War II, the Allied forces, they thought this was a just war. They did not know how just it was until afterward. And this also connects, just thinking about the Crusades, the medieval Crusades. A lot of people today would say the medieval Crusades are actually not a just war, despite being called by the religious authorities of that day. And so then this puts us in that tension of, do I think this is just? Because it might be that the authorities say that it's just, and they're calling me to participate in this. My country's going to war, but I might disagree with them. I might say, I don't think this is a good thing.
During Vietnam, all the folks that, said, no, I'm not going. I'm going to Canada or I'm going somewhere, but I think it's wrong. And
okay, so moving on. We're getting close to the end. I'm gonna just talk about a few things for a minute, so bear with me. So I think in our discussion, this has been very fruitful, that we start to see two visions of the Christian life. And this has hopefully been in the background of all of our previous conversations. These two visions of what it means to be a Christian, how a Christian ought to live. The first one is described by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. It's exemplified in Scripture through the story of Esther. I think the phrase that we used before to describe it is something like making the best of it. It's living practically in a fallen world. We recognize the world is fallen, and so we can't live as if we are in Eden, as if we are in heaven and everything will work out. And that you have to compromise. There's a lot of compromise that goes on. And so we'll give one more title to this way of thinking, and that will be Christian realism. But in contrast to this, we might see another way, another vision for how Christians ought to live, and that is Christian idealism. And Stanley Hauerwas is a theologian who would defend this way of thinking, and it's a little bit similar to what we see in the life of Daniel, which I think this is deeply ironic because I think in discussions with y'all, I think not everyone by any means, but I think the majority are sympathetic to this Christian realism way of thinking. But if y'all recall from our first week of class, y'all were deeply sympathetic with Daniel over Esther. And so I hope that I've made my task in this is to show the merit to both of these. I'm not going to suggest that one of these is inherently better than the other, but I want you to be able to see why Christians might think that one way of these is good, or to see how both of them are good. That with the Christian idealism, what's going on here is this idea that we are sojourners, again to use biblical language, that this world is not our home, and because the world is not our home, we are called to live in a distinctive way, a way that doesn't look like the world, a way that does not compromise with the world, in the same way that Daniel did not compromise with the world. So there are these two ways of thinking about it. One that's practical, one that recognizes the fallenness of the world, the need to compromise, and one that says, yeah, the world is fallen, And that's why we don't want to participate in the world. We don't want to compromise with the fallen world. We need to live in a distinctive sort of way. For the last couple minutes, I want to suggest some ways that we see this in Scripture. In the Ten Commandments, we see something a little bit like this. In the commandment to not have idols. A lot of us think, yeah, I understand. Like, obviously, I know what it meant for them to have these graven images. But whenever we relate that to our lives as Christians today, probably most of us immediately go to, you shouldn't make money an idol. Or you shouldn't make success an idol. And what I would suggest is that you're actually confusing the first commandment with the second and the third commandment. The first commandment is don't have any other gods besides Yahweh, besides the one true God. So don't make money a god where it should be Yahweh is your God. But the second and the third commandment are more concerned with don't take God and misconstrue what God is. Don't make an idol where you say, this is Yahweh. Look, see, this is Yahweh. When that's true, that's not the real God. And so it's don't distort or give a new shape to what God really is. That might be saying that, God blesses the activities of my nation, of my country. God is a God of America. It might also look like saying that, whenever my congregation does this activity, that's God's will, is that we do this activity in my congregation. It's saying God wants this thing. God is this thing without giving it its due process and thinking, is this really reflective of God? It's just flippantly saying, yeah, that's God's will. This is what God desires for the country. Without slowing down and thinking about it. I think that's what it means to take the Lord's name in vain, is to say, yeah, this is what God would want, right? The other quick example I want to give you for how to think about Christians living in a distinctive way is regarding the fourth and seventh commandment, the Sabbath and stealing commandments, whichever numbers those are. That for both of them, the idea is, don't steal, have a day off of work. That's sort of the surface level of those commandments. What those commandments are suggesting to us is that we have to trust God. We trust God more than the people around us are trusting God. Trusting God in such a way that we are willing to say, I'm giving up an opportunity to be productive, to make money, in order that I can learn reliance on God, that God will feed me and clothe me. And this is completely counterintuitive to how Protestants, of which we are a part, have thought about work and throughout the history of our nation. We think of being productive is what God wants us to do. And to some extent, I agree. But we have to remember what's going on here in the commandment for Sabbath. It's a commandment to put your reliance on God and say, God is specifically asking me not to be productive, to not be busy, and to rely on Him. I think these are just some hints of what it would look like to be distinctive Christians, to be sojourners in the world, in a world that looks different from us. Okay, hopefully that gives you some things to think about throughout the next few weeks. This has been really lovely teaching and being with y'all. But don't worry, I'm going to do a victory lap in a few weeks. We'll talk about something else. See y'all in worship.
Encamped along the hills of light, ye Christian soldiers, rise and press the battle ere the night shall veil the glowing skies. Against the foe in veils angels below, let all our strength be hurled. Faith is the victory we know, that overcomes the world. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. His banner over us is love, our sword, the word of God. We tread the road, the saints above, with shouts of triumph trod. By faith they like a whirlwind's breath swept on o'er every field. The faith by which they conquer death is still our shining shield. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. On every hand the foe we find drawn up in dread array. Let tents of ease be left behind and onward to the fray. Salvation's helmet on each hand, with truth all girt about. The earth shall tremble neath our tread, and echo with our shout. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. To him that overcomes the foe, white raiment shall begin. Before the angels he shall know his name confessed in heaven. Then onward from the hills of light, our hearts with love aflame will vanquish all the hosts of night. In Jesus' conquering name. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory. Oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. I still have joy. I still have joy. After all the things we've been through, I still have joy. And I still have joy. I still have joy. After all the things we've been through, I still have joy. I still have peace. I still have peace. After all the things we've been through, I still have peace. And I still have faith. I still have faith. After all the things we've been through, I still have faith. I still have hope. I still have hope. After all the things we've been through, I still have hope. I still have love, sweet love. I still have love. After all the things we've been through, I still have love. And I still have joy. I still have joy. I still have joy. After all the things we've been through. After all the things we've been through. After all